Hello, welcome to Purdue University's Large Commercial Producer webinar. We're pleased to be able to share with you today some of the findings from a major national study of farmer buying behavior that was recently completed by the Center for Food and Agricultural Business. Today, I'm privileged to have two of my colleagues here with me to share with you some of the findings of that study to give you a bit of an overview of some of the exciting elements that we're discovering from this large national study. Immediately on my left, your right, is Dr. Alan Gray, who is the director of our Center for Food and Agricultural Business and gives us lots of direction in how the center's activities should progress. Then beside him and across from me is Dr. Mike Gunderson, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Food and Agricultural Business, who leads our research efforts in the large commercial producer study and several other studies that are active as well. We're going to jump right into this now and make sure that we're using our time as judiciously as we possibly can. Mike, since you were working over this study so closely, could you give us a little bit of a background on the things we'll be talking about today? Because I think we have 5 buckets of materials we're going to be talking about. One of those is what we're learning about producers' business strategies. We're going to be talking a little about another major section about their risks, how do customers buy, what kind of sources of information do they look at, and what are values they're looking for? Tell us how this all came about and what we're doing in this study.
Well, how it all came about is a certain Dave Downey got us started 25 years ago on this project. And I think when it got started, you probably focused mostly on the salesperson and the interactions. And over time, as other faculty have gotten involved, we've transitioned some of those focus areas. And that's why we have 5 buckets instead of maybe 2 or 3 now. So in the study, we've always had the goal, you've had the goal, I've had the goal of understanding the buying preferences of large-scale producers when interacting with agricultural salespeople, retailers, lenders, and manufacturers. This time we conducted the survey by mail, phone, and web, but the bulk of our more than 1,300 responses came by mail. So we do try to target all the commodities that are grown. Certainly folks that grow corn and soybeans know Purdue well, so we get a lot of folks that respond that grow corn and soybeans, but we do have, as you have already pointed out, a national sample. So we've got folks from every state across the country except for Alaska, so we're sorry we didn't get any of those folks growing bears or something, but we've got a nationwide sample, and reuse the USDA Ag Census to help guide what we're trying to accomplish here. So there's about 2.1 million farms in the United States, but our survey is intended to focus on those 88,000 farms that have revenues in excess of $1 million a year. We also really try to target that group of very large producers that have more than $5 million of revenue in a year. And so our sample heavily gets responses heavily from that group. And so as we do the analysis, we try to weight it back to the national USDA census to make sure that we're drawing conclusions that can be used across the country.
Mike, before we dig right into that, I want to make sure that our audience knows that we have the capacity, we think, for people to mail in their questions that we might have, and later in the program we should have the opportunity to address some of those questions, and so that information should be available where they can send this online to us.
Yeah, I don't know if you have an email address for them to send it to, but I think they've got a link that they can follow.
Would you take us into this first section? What are we to learn about producers' business strategies? Alan, you work extensively on strategy development. When I think of Alan Gray, I think a strategic person who looks at the strategies that different kinds of agribusinesses, including farmers, think about when they direct their own business. Could you give us a bit of an oversight of the kinds of things we've learned about farmers' decision processes from a strategic perspective?
Sure. So, Dave, one of the things that we believe is important and we see as a major transition happening in the industry is that increasingly serving the producer is very much a business-to-business type of activity rather than a business-to-consumer type of activity. Some would argue there's a blend of those things going on, and I certainly would say that's probably true. But as you think about the fact that farmers are consolidating and getting larger and more complex in their decision-making, increasingly everything they do looks just like any other business that you'd be in. Well, in a business-to-business type of setting where we're trying to serve those businesses with the things that we provide to them, it becomes increasingly important to think about how our services, our products, the things that we do to create value, how does that align with their strategies and what they're trying to pursue? And so the motivation behind this set of questions in the survey is to say, okay, how do farmers think about strategy? What are the things that make them successful in their strategies, the types of activities that make them successful? And so that was the point, was to try to explore that. Now, it's not in a survey so easy to just say, what's your strategy, right? So we have to think about ways in which we might ask them about strategies. And in this case, what we asked them was to think about those major factors that are the factors or elements, if you will, of a strategy, right? And those factors are around things like productivity. Here we call it production. It's around cost management, as we notice it here. It's about people management often is a core part of somebody's strategy, a talent strategy, if you will, for winning in the marketplace. Or marketing or output prices might be a key part of that producer's strategies. Or maybe it's about managing assets, right? How do we manage the relationships with our landowners as part of that asset management activity? Or how do we take care of machinery and the pieces of that asset puzzle that come together for this multi-million-dollar agribusiness company, as you think about it? And so we asked them to tell us, to rank for us, which of these elements of the strategy are the most important ones for the success of your farm. And we always get the question, well, what does success mean? And the honest answer is whatever they want it to mean. We don't want to define success for them, right? Now, we can take it from the research literature, and the research literature would say, look, success in a business-to-business setting is ultimately about the factors that determine income, right? So what are the things that are related to revenue? What are the things that are related to costs? And those things combined is what turns out to be whether or not you're going to be profitable or not. So there's a way to think about this. The success is probably mostly driven by, the farmer's answer is mostly driven by what makes me a profitable farmer, right? But we didn't define success specifically for them. We let them decide what that is. And research showed us that by and large, amongst the group of, or the averages of the producers, that their keys to success are cost management and productivity, production. Those are the first and second ranked. In the chart that's being shown there, it shows some 34%, I think it is, of producers say production is ranked number one, with 26% saying production is their second most important element of their strategy, while costs is at 36 and 28. Roughly, those two things are essentially equivalent. What I think that means is that for the most part, producers are trying to be successful by managing their cost per output unit. And that's sort of a generic way to say cost per bushel. Trying to manage their costs per bushel, or their cost per head of production if we're talking about the livestock, or the cost per hundredweight of milk, right? They're trying to manage the input costs relative to the output they get from it. It's not just one or the other, cost or production. And that doesn't surprise me much if you think about it from the standpoint of these are commodity producers. By and large, they're producing commodities of corn and soybeans in our sample, or they're producing wheat and barley, or they're producing milk. Okay, well, if you're a commodity producer, one of the keys to being successful is that you have to be able to manage your costs, right? And so we see that coming through here. But I will tell you, there are a number of things that I think are also important about this in terms of things like, for example, managing output prices. Amazingly, to some people, really low in terms of the ones that would rank that first. Output price management is only 9% of producers recognize that as a key success factor for them in their strategies. Most would say that seems to be much more important, should be much more important than that. I think there are two things that we can take from that. One is, they might be telling us, and we don't know this, but they might be telling us that they're not very good at it. it could be successful, but given the fact I'm not very good at it, thank goodness I've got other ways to be successful. Or what I suspect it has more to do with is that output prices are something I don't control very much anyway in a commodity business. I can do some marketing things at the margin, but look, I'm never going to be as good at trading commodities, if you will, managing that risk as, say, the folks at CME or other places are. So I design my business to be successful regardless of what happens to those ups and downs of those market prices. And I think that's an important mentality for us to understand amongst those producers. The other thing that I would tell you was really sort of interesting here is that we really saw some differences amongst people with respect to age. And in fact, I'll tell you, Dave, that throughout the entire survey, in some ways, there's this age component of this younger producer has a particular view of the world, it seems like, that's very much around trying to develop relationships. So I want to be careful not to say, well, it's all about relationships for them. It is in some ways, but it seems to be about, I want to be able to develop relationships with people that I can count on. And one of the ways that comes out in the strategies is that they believe that their key to success in their farm is about people management more so than it is any of the other factors. Really kind of a surprising result to us at first, but if you begin to think about it, what we've noticed in the data, for example, is that the younger producers tend to actually be on some of our larger farms, where they're probably multi-generation farms, and on those multi-generation farms, these younger producers are in charge of managing the people and the operations of that business to get things done, while perhaps the older generation is focused on community development and maybe marketing of the products, the things that are outside the scope of day-to-day operations. And these young folks realize that to get the job done in a complicated, large-scale business, I have to rely on people. Not just people internally, but people internally and people externally to me. And we find that to be a really interesting notion that the younger folks see that strategy being about relying on people.
I can't help but sit here and think about some of the early studies we've done. Every 4 or 5 years we've done one of these national studies, and as I go back, and old people tend to go back and think about old times, I guess, but how often today we have multiple, not in multiple generations in management, but several employees as a part of that operation. It was a very different thing than years ago when it was usually a father and a son or a father and a daughter at best. Now we got multiple people, and different people look at these different factors of success differently. When we get to the actual national conference that we're going to be having on November 7th and 8th, are we going to be able to go deeper inside of some of this information at that environment?
Yeah, of course. Here today we got 5 minutes or so to maybe talk about a topic.
Frustrating.
There we'll have a little bit more time to explore some of the elements of, okay, what's going on with these younger producers? How do we think about things, for example, like as it relates to strategy? What about the growth strategy? How does this strategy for success align with what kind of growth do we see? And do we see those that have particular elements of their strategy that are more important, that are growing faster than others, for example? Do we see certain farms who have a particular view of what their management success strategies are? Do they think about their relationships with their service providers and their salespeople in a different way? We're going to explore those kinds of things in much more detail. And, we'll probably talk to a farmer or two live and ask them what they actually think about the results to these surveys as well.
I'm really intrigued too with the fact that not only larger with more people in the operation, but we just had to come off of some pretty good years in agriculture, and what a lot of new generation people coming into that farm. And while the average age farmer gets a little older over time, we got a lot of people in the wings waiting to take over management. And I can't help but wonder if there's some cultural differences with millennials beginning to take over these decision making. Well, let's explore that at the national conference.
Yeah, we can do some.
Alan, you also looked at risk factors.
Yeah. So one of the things that drove us really was, we had done this question about management strategies a little bit the last time we did the survey. And one of the things that always still was perplexing to us was that price didn't seem to be as important. And we had asked a question about risk, and maybe there are some elements of risk that are important, and prices were more important. Output prices were a more important risk factor of that farm. And so this time we decided we should explore risk in a little bit more detail. And so we really kind of went and sort of took a real research approach to this, if you will, and said, let's go back to the literature and let's think about how farmers think about risk. Let's think about the things that we've learned over history about risk. And And really what happens is that farmers think about risk first in terms of bucketing it into major categories of the types of risk they face on their farm. There are really 5 basic buckets. Those 5 buckets are production risk. Of course, we could predict most of these. Production risk, marketing risk, which is really this sort of output price thing we've been exploring a little bit. Financial risk, that ability to actually cash flow the farm. Are we going to end up in bankruptcy? What do we do to manage that sort of risk? There's human risk that they worry about, particularly as people become a more important part of it. We want to think about how does that impact the farm. And then, of course, we have legal risk as it relates to whether it's around contractual agreements or some regulatory environment issues or public policy types of activities that may put the farm at risk. So those are sort of the 5 buckets of risk that we want to think about. And I think the key for us and for those of us in the audience, Dave, that are trying to serve commercial producers, right? We want to think about, and we do this all the time and sort of in our subconscious, okay, what are the things that make you successful? And we've explored that. And what are the things that keep you up at night? You know, that's the question we like to ask all the time. What are the things that keep you up at night? Well, this is effectively that question. What are the kind of things that keep you up at night? What are the risks that really you care the most about or have the most impact on your farming operation? And the more that we can know about those sorts of things that are the things that keep them up at night, the better opportunity we have to sort of align the value proposition that we have with where they are to help them sort of maybe sleep a little better at night, if you will.
So if we can identify those risk factors, we can think about the products or services that we're bringing to the farmer and relate those more specifically to probably what their biggest concerns are.
That's exactly right. Exactly. And so what we did this time, really kind of a cool thing, right? So we designed a question in a very specific way, and each of these 5 risk categories, we had the farmers understand what the risk categories were, right? And then we paired them up with each other and asked them which one of these 2 risks is more important to the success of your farm. And we paired them up each time, having them choose one or the other, one or the other, one or the other. And this sort of methodology, it's a little more taxing, honestly, for them to be able to answer in that system and having them make these trade-offs, right? But we get back from that a much better revealed preference, if you will, for the things that they view as the most important risk elements of their farming
operation. That really is important because initially, well, they're all important. They're nervous about all these things, but by going through pairs, you can begin to surface which ones
really rank higher for them, right? And in fact, Mike will tell you, I think last time we asked the question, on a scale of 1 to 9, how important are these risks to you? We had a lot of 8s and 9s because, all these risks are important. We wouldn't ever want to interpret this result saying, well, that risk doesn't matter to them at all. They all matter to them, no question about that. But which ones really sort of are the ones that stay up the most at night or drive their decision-making processes? And what we found was, not surprisingly, was that the number 1 ranked risk is production risk, right? They worry the most, they lose the most sleep, if you will, over production risk, that physical output. Am I going to have enough
yield or gallons and pounds of milk or
right. Well, look, Mike, Dave, think about this. This is, so remember back to the strategies piece, we're talking about this ability to control cost per bushel. Well, that means I need to control costs and I need to control bushels. And the more output I can have, the more my costs per bushel are going to be down. And weather is a vagary that we have a big challenge with. How do we manage through that process to try to keep that productive level up as high as we can? And it's a lot of risk that we face in that process because so many things that are out of our control. So a big part of the activity. And so this 36%, just to explain that 36% is a weight. So we asked them effectively what we did by having them make these choices. We're putting weights on out of 100 points, how many points would get assigned to this risk. And so 36% of the points were actually assigned to production risk. That's compared to financial risk, which turned out to be the second most important risk to them, was a 26%. 26% of the weight was on that, puts it in really second place. And I can't do the math off the top of my head, Mike, but it's roughly 50%. Yeah, production risk is 50% more important than financial risk, right? So financial risk is the next most important one of them, and that's not normal. Normally, price risk would have probably been second. And what we see in this survey coming through is, the downturn in the economy has really put farmers on edge with respect to their cash flows, their liquidity, what we call the cash burn rate, right? We're burning through a lot of cash right now, and increasingly as we continue to face this tight margin situation, really across crops and livestock, because we've faced this in both segments of the market, that those burn rates of cash have become concerning to farmers. It's going to be more and more difficult for them to maintain liquidity. And for as agribusinesses, this matters to us serving them because their decisions at the margin, we now know, are going to be impacted by their view of the risk they face of being able to cash flow their farming operation, and we want to keep that certainly in mind.
But on the production risk side, if it's all about weather, what can we do as an agribusiness? Just tell them to put everything under greenhouse? What are we going to...
That'd be a great idea, right? Can we get it all grown under glass, although that's an awful big expense there too. So certainly one of the things that we want to talk about are the things that technology does to protect the health of that plant, the health of the soil, to give that plant the most chance we can for it to survive drouthy weather or periods of wetness. Here in Indiana, it's different all over the country, whoever we're talking about, but in Indiana right now, certainly this western part of Indiana, we've had an awful lot of water. We still haven't got corn to be able to grow in actual standing water, if we can figure that out. I don't know how we figure that out, right? But the idea is that we need to talk to them about what are the things that we can do to give that chance, that plant the best chance we can, to grow that animal the best chance to be as productive as possible. And then, of course, they have other tools that are available to them, crop insurance and other sorts of risk management tools to help with that production risk. But the reality is, Mike, the vagaries of weather and things like that are a little hard to control, and sometimes that thing, the ups and downs of the weather can have really significant impacts on us. We all know that. But from an agribusiness perspective, the thing we can do is try to help them think about the investments they make to give those plants the best chance to survive, those animals the best chance to survive in that process. Now, the other thing that third was marketing risk. So it gets about 19% of the weight. And Dr. Gunderson and I were looking at this earlier. It turns out if you think about this, because the way the science was done in this case, literally production risk is twice as important to the farmer as marketing risk is. Now, this is aggregate, Dave. It's across all farmers. So we have to be careful to recognize that, and we'll break this down in the national conference and look at it in some more detail. But, we've got, for example, we have hog producers in this survey, right? Many of those hog producers are going to be under production contracts, which means that price risk is basically zero for them, or marketing risk for them is going to be zero. And as we've looked at the data, we do in fact see that, if you're in a more commodity business like a corn and soybeans, there'll be a little bit more weight on price. But interestingly, it's still not going to be ranked really highly like we might have thought, right? We're seeing in this that farmer recognizes I just don't have much control over price. I'm trying to manage my position in a little bit different way.
As you noted, we didn't ask this question the same way in 2012, 2013. Right. But do you think the economic environment that we're in is having an impact on that? If they shifted up the importance on the financial risks relative to marketing because of that change in the environment?
Well, I think my gut tells me that now, right? So over the last couple of years, which is the time we've done the survey, that burn rate on the cash has been high enough, Mike, that I think now it's top of mind, sort of a top of mind issue. If we'd even asked 2 years ago, it's a downturn in the market, but they probably still have quite a bit of cash. Maybe they're not so worried about it. Well, this will turn around a little bit. But a couple of years in a row, and next thing you know, this liquidity thing looks like a real problem for us. We want to make sure that we're managing our cash position correctly. So yeah, I think definitely, had we asked the question the same way 4 or 5 years ago, I don't think financial risk would have been anywhere near there. And that's sort of the nature of this business, right? The cyclical nature of the business means that sometimes farmers' preferences or what's top of mind or what's driving their decision making is going to shift for us over time, right? But one of the things that's a longer term shift, I think, and that's these last two, which is around people risk and legal risks. My belief is if we'd asked these 5 years ago, they'd have been lower. And asking them now, they're at 12 and 7, so they're still, substantially less than the major production, day-to-day activity sorts of risks that the farmer faces. But if we ask this 5 years from now, my prediction to the group is to say these are going to be higher then than they are now, right? Increasingly, managing people and relationships is going to become more and more important to these farms. That's typical of business-to-business type relationships where you start to see that it's that relationship amongst two equals, if you will, in the supply chain, that those things really begin to matter much more strategically to us. Certainly legal risks are going to continue to be increasingly major challenges for larger and larger farms to manage those legal risks as well. They're not as important here. They're ranked 4th and 5th out of the list, but I fully anticipate, as opposed to maybe those first 3 might continue to shift back and forth a little bit depending on the vagaries of the markets that we're facing at the time. Right. These 2 are going to keep creeping up on them for those larger and larger operations as being more and more important risks for them to be managed.
You know, I continually think about this business-to-business term that we keep using, because one of the most fundamental changes that have gone on in the last several years is this larger, more complex business that we're talking about, and therefore the buying patterns are changing because it is a business, doing business with another business. Mike, I know you explored a lot of those issues of how people buy things, and remembering all the time that it is each individual perhaps is a bit different, and we're looking at broad averages here, which will probably break down quite a bit further when we get into our national conference and have a couple of days to really dig into these things. But what kind of things did you discover as we're thinking about how they buy things? And by the way, buying is inputs, but it's also buying marketing services. So it's both sides. It's not just inputs we're talking about, and it's not just crops. It's crops and livestock. What have we learned so far that's really intriguing about the buying process?
Yeah, and I appreciate the observation that a lot of times the elevators and folks that are buying grain from farmers call them customers. It's the only place where we cut the customer a check. It's always interesting, that conversation. But we did ask producers this time about marketing their products versus buying seed and other expendable items or capital items, or even acquiring financing. And so we wanted to take a look, and you probably remember a year ago us practically coming to fisticuffs over this question and how we were going to ask it. So we finally settled on asking folks, how many suppliers do they compare? And do they compare all the suppliers in their area? Do they feel like they have choices to even go to when they acquire some of these things? So in this particular slide, we're looking at them making a decision about marketing their production. So they're comparing the options they have to achieve probably the highest price they can for their commodity output. And it's the case, we've got 2 pie charts here. The one on the left is 61% of the respondents said, no, I don't compare all the options I have available to me in the marketplace. And 39% said, yeah, you bet I do. I compare all the options because I want to make sure I get the best price I can. And then what you see inside those pie charts is how many did they compare then? And about 15% of those that didn't compare all options just went to one. Maybe a trusted supplier, maybe somebody they've got a long-term relationship with. They trust them, they're not going to shop it around, and from a supplier's perspective, that's a pretty valuable relationship to have. And only 7% of those that did shop it around felt like it was the only choice they had. So most of our farmers feel like, especially for marketing their production, they have quite a few options. If we look at this chart about marketing production relative to acquiring financing, they couldn't be more different. Now, overall, the size of the pies are relatively similar. About 70% don't compare everybody. About 30% do compare everybody. But when you look at how many they compare, it's 1, maybe 2 for the bulk of the sample, whether they compare them all or not. So a lot of folks feel like they only have one choice, and so about 11% of those in that only one choice sample only go to that one. Another 12% felt like they only had a couple of options to compare.
Now, we don't know whether that's actual fact, they only had 1 or 2, but their perception of that was that realistically, they really didn't have a lot of comparisons they wanted to make. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, and I certainly didn't sit down with 1,300 producers and ask them individually, but it does seem that's the case. They feel like they've only got a couple options. So, but like I mentioned, this is a big difference between shopping around marketing production and obtaining financing. Yes. For the most part, folks are only going to go to 1 or 2, and that might be a challenge for our ag lenders who are trying to establish new relationships with farmers. It's really going to be a challenge to break in as they're making comparisons. So, and I suspect when that happens, it's less about price, right? So if I'm shopping around a lot, that's probably about getting the best price for my output. If I'm not shopping around on financing, there's probably other things that influence that, the relationship, the convenience, the features of the loans that I'm acquiring, those kinds of things.
Interesting.
So I'm I'm certainly glad that we arm wrestled about that question. It's got some additional interesting things that we'll talk about in November. Another thing that we did ask this time, and we asked last time too, we asked, have you changed a major supplier in the last 5 years? Last time, 70% said they had not changed a major supplier in the last 5 years. This time we had about 53% said they hadn't made any changes. So in the last 5 years, we've seen a pretty big increase in the number of folks that are making switches. Now, part of that might be a result of how we asked the question, because Scott Downey pushed me and said, did we ask them why they switched last time? And I said, well, no, we didn't. And so we went ahead and asked them this time, what were the reasons? So for those 47% that have changed in the past 5 years, what were the reasons for changing suppliers? And those either quick with a calculator or quick with sums in their heads are going to see this adds up to more than 100%. They could choose more than one reason. So if they had switched suppliers and there was more than one factor that caused that, they could check all that apply. And probably not too surprising, prices is a big reason for changing. About almost 30% of those that did switch, switched for prices. But service problems following right up closely behind that. So don't want to drop the ball either on being competitive on price or doing the service as well that they need.
So when my competitor drops the ball and has a problem, might be some opportunities to really go after some new business, then you're suggesting?
I would think so. I would think that we've got to communicate the values that we can bring, and those are some of the things at the top of producers' minds. I think one thing of note there is a change of staff or salesperson. I know we at Purdue put a lot of young folks out into the sales force every year, so that means there is some changes, but probably not as big a factor as we might sometimes want to think it is when we change that salesperson relationship. You know, one of the things we're always interested in the large commercial producer survey is how these things differ by farm size. You can see that the vast majority of our mid-sized producers, so those under $1 million in revenue, aren't switching. They're not changing. And when you think about 2.1 million farms in the U.S., that's a pretty big bulk of them. And so that might be comforting. The challenge is those largest producers control a lot of acres, they control a lot of head, and they make a lot of expenditures, and so they're much more likely as a group to switch. In fact, 60% of our largest producers have switched a major supplier in the past 5 years. And they tend to be a little bit more price sensitive, so it does tend to be more about price, but service problems following right behind again.
Mike, I'm really anxious to dig into those and tear them apart a bit more and look at different commodities or different parts of the country or different ages and how all that plays in. But I also am really interested in where farmers are getting their information.
Yeah.
What have we learned, at least at a high level? Can you tease me a little bit with some of the information we've got about where farmers look for information?
Yeah. So producer sources of information has been a question I think you asked on the very first one. We've always tweaked a little bit how we ask about it or what we ask about. I don't even think text messages or Twitter existed the first time you did this survey.
That's
so
right, they didn't.
Social media.
You make me feel really old, you know that?
Did you at that time still tie notes to pigeons and fly them out?
That's not nice.
Oh, sorry about that.
So this blue bar on this chart wouldn't have even been an option, even 10 years ago. And so we're looking to see, as they start to form their perception of the products and services that we offer, where do they go to collect the information about that? And so personal communication is very important as a group. Its mean is highest amongst our sample, and social media getting a pretty low score there. Although I would say, for those that use social media, they're ranking that pretty high, and there's a pretty intense group. And then there's a huge percent, probably 70%, that said that's not important at all, and that's probably because they don't use Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. So if we think about it, personal communication are those general farm magazines, dealer, retailer meetings, farm shows. I think when we work with agribusiness groups, they often wonder about the value of setting up another booth at another farm show, but when the producers are collecting information, they really value that interaction. Traditional media, farm magazines, dealer, retailer meetings, farm shows. If you think about the farm magazines, I think we always are wondering, is it worth killing another tree to send out another publication? But our producers value, in the survey at least, they say they value having that magazine to read.
That's amazing how that continues to hold. I'm going to be interested to see if we when we dig deeper, whether that is age-related or different industries. I can't wait to get into that in more detail at our national conference.
I agree. I think a topic worth exploring. A little bit different tack in terms of information sources isn't necessarily the different pieces that we use to reach a producer, but how do they prefer to be communicated with by their salesperson? How do they want their salesperson to reach out to them? And so we gave them some choices here in terms of face-to-face with an appointment, letter, email, telephone, face-to-face, no appointment, or text. And I know Alan has some perspective on this, so I'll let him share it. But one thing that I think is worth noting is face-to-face with an appointment is really, really dominant over without an appointment, and that's especially true for our largest producers. So they prefer to have a face-to-face appointment rather than not. And even though that 9 bar looks pretty small, what you see is 8, 7, 6. Those large producers stack up pretty fast wanting an appointment. And I suspect that's because they're very busy. They have a full agenda and they don't need somebody just dropping by to fill up the time.
Yeah, and that's not a new idea. We've been playing with that idea for some time. But boy, when these numbers come out that strong, that's strong. I suppose it depends on the person a bit. I suppose it may depend upon the culture, the part of the country a little bit. But that's really strong data that we're demonstrating that way.
Well, and one of the things I think, and we want to try to explore this, at least with our farmer panels when we have them at the national conference around, I view the message as they want to talk to you about things that are important to them on their time, not on your time. So if you set an appointment with them, that's on their time, right? If you send them a letter in the mail, because one of the questions is that, the result there was a letter, and people scratch their head and go, letter. Well, there's all kinds of ways in which we could use communications in sort of a paper form, whether it's in a letter in the mail or a magazine in the mail or whatever the case may be. But that farmer's going to read that physical piece of communication on their time. Or email might be the preferred method for an electronic version of the same thing as something out of the mail, but it's on their time. You think about those last 3, telephones, a face-to-face drop-by, no appointment meeting, or a text even. Those are things that are imposing on that farmer's time. And doesn't matter whether it's real or not, the perception is they're very busy people, don't have a lot of time. They want to manage their time. They'll talk to you when they want to talk to you. They don't want to talk to you on your time. And that's just a hypothesis on my part. Of course, we don't ask that question directly in the survey, but it's something I think we want to explore with those farmers, how important they think it is to be able to make sure that the decision-making process, they get to control the time in which they do that.
I think one of the things that is sort of popular out there in the media is all the differences by generation and how generations buy things differently. And one of the things we saw in our survey, at least with respect to communication with a face-to-face appointment, not really that different by generation. The millennials aren't as into their phones and their electronics as we might think when it comes to meeting with their salesperson. Now, what I would point out that's not on this slide is that younger group, those millennials and Gen Xers, prefer email to letter. And the older groups, the baby boomers and the silent generation, they prefer letter to email pretty strongly. So definitely different ways to approach those two markets. And when you know that, you probably also tailor the message a little bit in those marketplaces. For a guy that wrote the book on agricultural sales, I suspect this next slide is probably pretty interesting to you. Why would they want to meet a new salesperson? And again, we can check all that apply. So it adds up to well over 100% because producers checked multiple reasons for wanting to meet a new salesperson. But leading the list again is a good price on a product, but probably not even statistically significantly different. We've got over half the sample also willing to meet if you got a new product or a new idea. So
I presume new salespeople doesn't necessarily mean young salespeople. It's like a different salesperson, right?
Well, yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah,
yep.
okay.
So we've got the full age distribution of salespeople
Yeah,
as
we
well
do.
as decision makers on the farm. So, yeah, I think one of the things you observed earlier, Dave, is current supplier messed up. Does that mean we've got an opportunity? But that's not necessarily a reason why they're looking for it. They want salespeople to come and bring them some information about their offering, maybe rather than beating up on the competition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where do we go now?
Well, I hesitate a little bit to go here because I think a couple of folks that I've interacted with say producers don't understand value anymore. But what we do want to try and think about is how do producers make trade-offs between these three factors, price, product performance, and supplier relationship.
You know, we've looked at that price, product performance, and relationship a lot for the last 15 or 20 years.
Yep.
And it continues to be a very significant issue
Yes.
and difference between different people.
Yep.
That's where it gets down to the one-on-one.
Right. Well, and I think part of the reason that we do it is because a lot of the agribusinesses that we work with think everything's always about price. Now, the whole region that I operate in, they're always beating me up about price and what are the other things that I can do. And I think our survey has shown over time that there is a price-sensitive group. And it's probably going to be 25 to 33% of any segment for any product. There's just going to be those hardcore price folks. But we also have big segments that care about those other two factors as well. So that's true in animal nutrition. You can see we had them rank price, product performance, and supplier relationship. So there's 6 different groups they could fall into based on how they ranked those three. The largest group, just like last time, is that performance price relationship group. The second largest group is relationship price performance, and the third largest group is price performance relationship, with those other 3 groups taking a very small fraction. If we just break down those 3 largest groups and say, hey, does it matter at all by size? It sure does. Those that are our largest producers, they are, as a group, their largest percentage is in performance price relationship, and the smallest there is the relationship price performance. So there are differences across size for those biggest groups. And one of the things we're thinking about for November is how does that vary by product? So we asked them, for livestock growers, we asked them about animal nutrition, animal health, genetics, capital items. Do they rank those 3 things the same regardless of the product they're buying or not? So we're going to take a look at that in November. On the crop side, we looked at seed as being one thing to think about, and here performance price relationship is the biggest group by far. Relationship price performance following second again, but price performance relationship coming in third. And if we break those down again for our largest producers, a pretty similar story where those that are largest producers, the greatest percent of them end up in performance price relationship. So when I think about how that influences our agribusinesses, it is probably the case that our producers in the best position to beat us up on price because they buy a lot of volume and they're going to pressure us, they're actually not putting a whole lot of weight on that, and they might be receptive to a discussion that focuses on my product's higher performing, and that's why I've got a bit of a premium price.
Wow. So there's farmers that fall heavily in each of those different categories. So one of the things that we have to focus on is how to understand the unique differences of individuals, because whenever we get to the sales relationship, we're dealing with one-to-one rather than large groups, even though our marketing strategy has to look at segments of the marketplace. When we move that to the sales perspective, that becomes segments of one, because the individual salesperson has to understand the uniquenesses of the value structure, the importance of different elements, the current situation of every particular customer. And we have information that sheds light on some of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Dave, that every customer is an individual that we have to approach with a specific message. But I also think that it's helpful to be prepared with a message that's going to resonate with that customer as we go to the farm. And there are things about that farmer that puts them into a group that helps us tailor our message. So if we're focused on a very price-sensitive buyer, we better not show up without some information about how we compare on price. If we're going to a relationship buyer, we better be prepared to talk about their goals as a business and how the things that we're doing help them achieve those goals and be ultimately successful, as Alan started off with.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me as really important is that we hear this term trusted advisor or trust issues. Are we prepared to talk at all about how trust develops as a result of some of the information studies we're doing on this or other studies at Purdue?
So, you know, Dave, it's funny that you asked that. For those who know that we've been doing this survey for a long time, We've asked the question on the survey for all of the 5 times we've done it before. What are the most important attributes of the salesperson, right? And the number one thing that was answered every time was what?
Trust.
Honesty, right? Honesty and trust. We used to say, what?
Yep,
Honesty. What does
honesty.
that mean? Does that mean that they know a whole bunch of dishonest salespeople? What does honest mean? And over time, everybody began to say, well, that's what the answer is going to be. But ultimately, we don't really know what that means. And so we've done a fair bit more research now, and have colleagues that have worked with us on doing research on trust. And the idea being that honesty is really tied directly to, can I trust somebody? And so we have questions in this survey. This time around, in fact, we didn't ask the question anymore about honest, because we already know what the answer is going to be.
Every time it's the same thing.
It's the same thing over and over. So we didn't even ask that question anymore. We're moving on from that. Instead, we're exploring more deeply, right? And so now we're asking about elements of trust, and what are the elements of trust that matter to that individual producer, and thinking about, are there groups of producers that think about trust in particular ways that would manifest itself in saying, well, that's an honest person. Are they honest because they follow up well, or are they honest because they keep confidential information confidential, or are they honest because they know their products really well, right? Those are the sort of the elements that build up trust, and so we're now able to look at what exactly does it mean to be honest or to build trust with a person, so that perhaps we can get past the buzzword of trusted advisor and start to say, okay, well, I'm an advisor. How do I build trust, right?
Yes.
Rather than titling myself a trusted advisor, I'm going to be an advisor. Now, how do I build trust, right?
I don't know that I've ever worked with anyone in this industry that didn't feel like their customers trusted them. I mean, that's a natural thing to people believe that. And yet at the same time, the differences in how farmers perceive their business, and I'm particularly interested in this, what is a farmer's business model? What are those elements? You started out our conversation with some of the elements that farmers are thinking about in terms of managing their success. Right. And how do we understand those elements of success that we can impact as suppliers of marketing services, or crop protection services, or seed, or any of the input elements? How do we begin to build those together to create a real value for the customers?
Yeah. So let me give you an example where I think it's related to that I find very interesting. If you look at the data on this younger group, who I believe is heavily focused on the operational activities of the business, right? And that they believe people is their strategy for success, managing people relationships, internally and externally. They're worried about the ability to get the day-to-day operations done, right? To get them done in a timely fashion, to make sure things happen in the right way. And when they're worried about that, when you want to build trust with that person on the farm, which is going to be critically important for many of our suppliers, you want to build trust with them, timeliness, following through and doing what you say you're going to do, number one thing to build trust for them. Yeah. Not your technical competence in the products themselves, or even your ability to be confidential in the information.
It's almost like they assume your technical skills.
That's right. Or that maybe they're younger college educated people, and maybe they have the technical skills, but here's the thing. I can't get all the things done I need to do on this farm to be successful by myself. I need help. You tell me you're going to do something, and then you do it. That's one less thing I got to worry about in terms of getting the job done here, and that's what's going to build that relationship with me over time, is I'm now trusting you that when you say you're going to do something, okay, now none of us say we're going to do something and then don't intentionally follow up, but if I begin to realize in this one-to-one relationship that for this person, the number one thing I got to do is follow through on time and understand when they need it and why it is that they need it at that time.
Do what you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do it.
That's exactly right. And
Then
I know that's the number one thing he values. I'm going to make sure we deliver on that, right? Even if I'm the salesperson and I'm not going to do the delivery on it, I'm going to make sure I go back to the company with the message that says, look, right, this is the customer, that timeliness is the number one thing. We got to prioritize for them, timeliness, right?
We had a question come in from one of our observers, watchers, participants. Did we hear anything about GMOs in this study that we did? Did that come up at any point? Did we specifically explore that?
Well, Reed didn't, Dave, and I'll tell you why. I think we have a lot of colleagues in agricultural economics departments across the country that are looking at this GMO issue, particularly from a consumer side and willingness to accept kinds of things. And I think our producers are making decisions incorporating that information, and so Reed didn't put that question out there in front of them directly. I don't know if you're seeing that differently.
No, certainly we didn't put that question out there directly. One of the things that it does manifest itself in is in our risk management questions, we ask them about legal risks and policy or public perception risks, which would be around the argument of GMO versus non-GMO. They just don't see that as a really big risk to them. I think from the farmer's perspective, they assume that the industry is going to be taking care of these things. Now, of course, you know, to be very honest, Dave, where the industry doesn't take care of it well for them, the courts will. Right, so I think the farmer says, look, I'm going to make the best decision I can make for my farm. I can't control all these markets and all these consumers. I'm going to try to do the best that I can for my operation, and I'm going to assume the industry is taking care of these sorts of social impact issues. I don't, to be honest with you, I'm not sure I agree with the farmer. I think they ought to be a bit more cautious and a bit more careful about the way in which they make those decisions, because it could, in fact, impact them directly. But it certainly seems as though when we think about that idea of legal risk, is ranked fifth and only 7% of the weight. They don't see that as driving their decision making too much.
I presume then too, we didn't, in this particular kind of study, we didn't get too much into traits and genetics, and that's pretty fine tuning in the decision process. And we're not able in this kind of a study to get specifically into those kind of issues.
That's right, Dave, but we do ask questions, and we've had them on the survey for quite a while. Do producers see differences in products? Do producers see differences in the quality of services performed by their retailer?
Right.
Do they see differences in the quality of the salespeople, right? So we do have some information, broadly speaking. Yeah. It's not about particular traits or particular characteristics of a product, but we do have some things to say about that. And I think particularly on the generic versus branded side, we've seen some movement. Folks, particularly our largest producers, not seeing as much difference between the performance of a generic product versus a branded product.
So we did address generics
Correct.
versus branded products. In fact, very extensively, I think.
And we have seen a shift in that over time, and we have a hypothesis. Again, something we want to explore more in the national conference, I think, with some folks is I think the definition of generic over time in our survey has actually changed for the farmer. Right, I believe that the farmer and the ones that I've talked to anecdotally tell me, well, I think of that as private labels. So generic used to be white bottle, black word, chemical, or weed killer, or whatever the case may be. But today, the farmer's a much more sophisticated buyer. So they think about off-patent active ingredients as being generic,
right.
And that's off-patent active ingredient. Now that's in private label bottles. And okay, how do I feel about that? A fair amount of the producers are saying, there's not as much difference in performance now as I might have once seen between generics. So, not directly related to traits and genetics that they want to choose amongst. But I would tell you this as it relates to seed for that question that was asked. Clearly, performance is a number one factor with respect to the seed buying activity, right? I want seed that's going to perform at the highest level. Now, what's the exact stack of traits and genetic it wants it on? We don't know the answer to that, but very clear performance is the number one factor for them.
Mike, we had another question that came in. One of the things we look at often is the size of the farm operation and how they responded differently perhaps to some of these issues. And you covered it very briefly to start with, but could you remind us one of the questions that came in, what the three size categories are that we're using, what that terminology is that we're choosing to use on those three size classes?
And what we're mostly focused on, Dave, is revenues. So because we're covering different commodities, it doesn't make sense to do it by acres or by head. So we try to create a variable that says, what is the revenue size of these different operations? So we ask them, what's the number of corn and soybean acres you grow now? What's the number of corn and soybean acres you plan to grow in 5 years? What's the number of dairy cows you milk now? What's the number you plan to milk in 5 years from now? And recreate from that a farm revenue number for the producer that responded, and then reline them up with the USDA's farm size category. So they have this low sales, moderate sales, large, and very large group that you see on the screen here. Regrouped all of our Mid-sized producers there from 150,000 to $1 million. Our commercial producers are $1 million to $4 million, and then our largest producers have more than $5 million in revenue a year.
So we didn't do it on we use dollars for size, which means if you're a strawberry or vegetable farm in California, it doesn't take a lot of acres to be in that large category. If you're in Montana or South Dakota and wheat, it takes a lot more acres to be in those kind of categories.
And it certainly matters whether we sell our corn for $7 a bushel or $3.25 a bushel, where we fall in that revenue category. So that's a challenge for us. But ultimately, when we go back to make sure we can say something about the nation's farmers, we try to weight it back to USDA, and that's the number they use. Now, one of the things that we'll try to think about for November is when we look at acres. Does a particular farmer strategy dominate the acres? Does a particular buying behavior preference dominate the acres? If we look at it from a livestock side, how does the behavior go from a farmer decision-making level to control of assets and the amount of expenditures they're likely to incur? So those are things that we're thinking about, but we do ultimately have this revenue category behind us.
Mike, when another person wrote in a question, says, what kind of questions were asked of the farmer to kind of screen? That is, what qualified a person's information to actually be rolled into the study versus others that perhaps for one reason or another didn't quite work in the study that we're doing here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. The very first question on the paper survey is that question about number of acres. How many acres of corn and soybeans do we grow? How many acres of wheat and barley do we grow? How many acres of fruit, nuts, and vegetables do we have? We looked at that, and if they're not over that threshold of $150,000 or more, they're not a part of our 1,350 plus respondents that we've included in the sample.
So yeah, those lowest sales categories that they call it at USDA just wouldn't be in our survey. Typically, we're just not focused on that very smallest sort of part-time. I think what we might consider a part-time farmer. The other thing would be if they're not producing the major commodities that we are interested in doing here, they wouldn't be considered a part of this sample of folks either, right? So.
But there's no, maybe to sort of intersect your other question about GMOs and organic, there's no prohibition on a producer's methods of growing their crops or livestock. We're taking all comers that are doing that.
So there's tons of information that we've gathered, and we're actually still in the process of examining the details of that and will for months to come. In fact, I can see right now some grad students are going to have some interesting projects to really get deeply involved in the information. And still, since we've completed the study just a few months ago, we've been doing a lot of work on trying to understand the big picture issues that might be really important to marketers and sellers of both livestock and crops, both parts of that in agriculture. Alan, as we think about what's one thing that really stands out in your mind that we're kind of seeing right now that may just be a reinforcement of things that we've seen before, but have nuanced that makes it quite different, or something that stands out in your mind?
Well, I would tell you, Dave, that one of the things that has always been the case for us and this survey, and continues to be today, you can't put farmers in a bucket of this is how large producers behave, and this is how small producers behave, and this is how commercial producers behave. You can't easily put people into buckets that say, well, if you're this age, you have these preferences, or this age, you have these preferences. And that's a challenge for us in the industry, because as an industry, that's how we want to do it. Hey, can I look at that producer and categorize them and say that's how they're going to behave? And I think in some ways, I think it's the value of the survey too. This survey really explores farmers' behaviors. And of course, where we could find a behavior that they have, a preference that they have that lines up with something that we could look at them and say that's who they are, we would certainly point that out. But that's a difficult thing to do. Mike was talking about size earlier. I would tell you that the work we've been doing right now says that the largest farmers behave in many ways the same way mid-sized farmers behave and commercial farmers behave. There are no clear categories that say, well, if they're large, they're going to do this. And so I think that's the one thing that I would take away from it, is that building relationships, even in a business-to-business setting, understanding that business, right? And understanding that business's psychology for what they prefer, that's going to be the key.
Uniqueness of that particular grower.
You can't just put them in a bucket and say, well, because they're a large producer that is a $5 million, therefore they have to be done this way. It's just not the case.
No question. We have some very large operations that are very relationship oriented
That's
and
right.
who they do business with.
Absolutely.
And we have some people that are moderate size or smaller size that are very price conscious.
Yeah.
You just can't put them in a bucket. Mike, what's one thing that sticks out in your mind?
Well, if I can take the luxury of two, first of all, I'd say Nicole Widmar and Nathan Thompson are leading our efforts on the risk management question, and they've been sharing some of the stuff that they've been putting together. They're grouping these farmers, so you're saying they're all sort of individually different, but I think Nicole and Nathan are finding some evidence around the risk management piece. There's some characteristics of those, the way they approach risk. So I think they've been partnering with a grad student, Courtney Burr, on that, and I think it's going to be really dynamite stuff. They're going to have a session in the morning. I think the other topic that is really interesting that's new to the survey is a focus on sort of procurement, which probably doesn't mean anything to anybody except us academics, but thinking about just how do they buy? What are those relationships? What are the things that they're weighing as they buy?
Sure, because if it's more and more of a business, then we'd almost expect they would take more of a business approach to buying, which is where that term procurement comes from. If I could just understand more of what's going through my customer's mind when they are procuring or developing the relationship, then I've got a much better shot at alignment with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, our questions around that have come because Mike Bulgy has pushed us to think about that. Do larger producers have a different mindset, a different buying behavior than producers in the past? And so he's got some insights that he's drawn around that I think are going to be pretty interesting.
Mike,
and we're hoping to put together some outside industry folks to give us some perspective on that as well.
You've mentioned several different faculty members. At our national conference, we're going to hear from Mike Bulgy?
Mike Bulgy.
Who else?
Dave Downey. Scott Downey.
Okay.
Alan Gray. The usual guys, the usual cast of characters. We're also going to hear from some new faculty that we've had join the department. And so looking forward to having Nicole and Nathan on the stage for the first time.
And it's not all just Purdue faculty on this?
No.
No. In fact, we're going to have folks from outside the industry. Consumer Electronics Distributors is actually a speaker from there. Mr. Selby, I believe, is his name.
Yep. Brad
Mr.
Selby.
Selby's going to be coming in. He's talking to us, in fact, about this procurement activity and how in their business, what they do is they distribute electronic parts and things of that nature to electricians. And over time, electricians have become much more accustomed to using what we might call bid sheets. I find bid sheets to sometimes be a negative connotation, but it's a way of thinking about, okay, other price is part of this, of course, but what other elements do you bring to that?
What other things you're looking for?
And this distributor has really shifted their business model to be able to cater to that particular activity and deliver value, learn how to be a value-added distributor of these important parts to a set of folks who really do take a procurement type of mentality to it. I think that's going to be a great opportunity to explore, okay, outside of our industry, how are they dealing with this increasing view of sort of business-to-business, very professional procurement activity.
And we're going to be bringing in some well-respected farmers to get their take on how they interpret these things.
Yeah.
Dave Nelson, a farmer from Fort Dodge, Iowa, who is quite well known and highly respected, is going to be sharing with us some of his perspectives. We have a farmer from Illinois that's going to be coming in. We have a fellow from Ohio that's going to be here. We've got one or two other farmers that are, if harvest is right, we're going to have them here as well to give their perspective on things. And we really, really hope that each of you watching will find information here that is exciting and potentially useful for your business. Incidentally, I'm told that it's been organized that if you're signed up for this particular webinar, there's a discount that you're going to be able to use to come to this conference that ought to be significantly interesting to you. And also the possibility of several organizations have indicated to us that they could bring more than one or two people from the organization, and we have that covered as well. In fact, one of the things I found most interesting is the conversations that occur between people in the same organization that experience this information flow that's coming out of this study as they drive or fly back to where they're coming from. It's on your minds, it's top of their minds. You spend a day and a half of looking at these things in some real detail and then thinking about what this could mean to our strategy and our business. So we hope you will join us on November 7 and 8 here on the Purdue University campus as we talk in great depth about the large commercial producer study of 2017. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Dave.